Okay, so like I said, we are back in Matthew 20 this morning. And so we're going to get into this little paradox that Jesus is going to lay on us about the kingdom of God. He says that the way up is down. And as people who have probably been to more than a few church services, we may have some notion of what he's talking about. But when he said this the very first time, you really kind of have to believe that there were some puzzled looks on the faces of the people who were listening to him, because the way up is up, right? Like, that's kind of weird. And so last week we dug into some of the new insights, or some new insights maybe, about the nature of the grace of God. And I think that we looked at some pretty cool things. And the material that we're going to look at this morning is directly related to the stuff that we talked about last week. And so I think that it's probably a good idea to try and think of relationships between what we're going through this morning and the things that we talked about last week, if you were here. And then primarily this morning, we're going to be talking about the role of authority and leadership from God's point of view. So to get things going, I think we're just going to jump into the text here. And so this is Matthew 20, starting in verse 17. And it says, "Now as Jesus was going up to Jerusalem, he took the 12 disciples aside and said to them, 'We are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be betrayed to the chief priests and the teachers of the law. They will condemn him to death.'" So he's talking about himself here. "And will turn him over to the Gentiles to be mocked and flogged and crucified. On the third day, he will be raised to life." So we know from other passages that this was not the only time that Jesus warned them that this was coming. All right, there are like 15 different passages where Jesus tells them something like this between the 4 different Gospels. So that's not like 15 separate times, but it is several times that he said this. And we know from some of the other accounts that they generally didn't understand what he was saying. And like in Mark 9, they tended to interpret this extremely metaphorically. And so they thought it was some kind of symbol. It says that they debated among themselves what the expression "rising from the dead" might mean. There is no place in all of their thinking and all of their suppositions for a Messiah that was going to die and be raised from the dead. And so it just wasn't part of the career path that they were taught that the Messiah was going to take. And so they had figured out that already that Jesus was the Messiah, so they knew for sure that it was not possible for him to die, because the scriptures say that the Messiah lives forever. They didn't have any category at all for 2 separate comings or anything like that. So this stuff that Jesus is saying is sailing like right over their heads. But you can see that Jesus knew exactly what was coming. This was, in fact, the very reason that he had come to earth. He's pretty set on this fate of a torturous death that's looming in front of him at this point. And so this death for the sake of humanity is what Jesus is aspiring to. And so that's one of the pictures that we have here. And then in verse 20, it says, "Then the mother of Zebedee's sons came to Jesus with her sons, and kneeling down, asked a favor of him." And so this is the mother of the disciples, the disciples James and John. So that's John, the author of the book of John. And we do not have a book from this particular James, but the mother comes with her sons to ask Jesus a favor. "What is it that you want?" he asked. She said, "Grant that one of these 2 sons of mine may sit at your right and the other at your left in your kingdom." All right, so where do we begin? All right. This is wrong in almost every possible way. Okay. This is kind of pitiful and kind of messed up. But to clarify what she's asking, to sit on the king's right hand is to be like his number one advisor. And so that's the second in command. And to sit on the left hand would be the one who would be like third in power in that kingdom. And so Jesus is heading towards Jerusalem, and they're assuming that it's about time for the Messianic kingdom to be established. And like most of the people that are following Christ around, they think that they are sort of in on the ground floor. And they think that since they're personal friends with the new CEO, then they're going to have pretty high positions in this new administration. And so they're basically trying to make sure that they cut in the line with their buddies and get the most power of anyone in the kingdom besides the Messiah himself. And they've got their mom coming to do the speaking. And so she's probably a little bit older than Jesus, and, maybe that's supposed to count for something. But it becomes clear as this goes on that they're in this with her. All right. It's not like they have their heads buried in the sand and, they can't believe what their controlling mom is doing in this situation. They are definitely down with this whole thing. Okay. And so what we're looking at in what we've already read is two very different visions of leadership. And so the first one is where Jesus is talking about going down and being betrayed and beaten and killed and crucifixion. And the other vision of leadership is these guys like scrapping for personal power and more prestige in themselves. And they're just, as determined to take as Jesus is to give. And so you really could hardly get any further apart than these two visions. And I am certain that this has been recorded for us and arranged this way on purpose. All right, they're trying to tell us something here. So then in verse 22, Jesus says, "You don't know what you're asking." Jesus said to them, "Can you drink the cup that I am going to drink?" "We can," they answered. So they don't have the slightest idea what they're even talking about. They really don't have a clue. And you notice it is they that answered. It's not just the mother here. It's them saying that they can handle this. And Jesus is surprisingly merciful in this whole exchange. I actually can't believe that he doesn't do a single smackdown in this whole little episode. He never once says, "Would you just sit down and shut up and quit making a fool out of yourself?" He just sort of patiently works with them, letting them know that they don't understand what they're saying. And so they're looking for this crown of glory, and they're not ready for a crown of thorns. All right, they have no idea. They say they want to go with Jesus, and he is really trying to warn them that it doesn't lead where they think it leads. Okay? And Jesus said to them, "You will indeed drink from my cup." And so the cup that he's referring to is that cup of suffering. So you'll remember in the garden on the last night of his life, Jesus uses the same language when he asks God if there's any way that he can remove this cup from me. And it's the cup of the cross. And that's what he's asking if they think that they can handle here. And they say, "Sure." All right. And so he's basically saying, okay, that can be arranged. And it was arranged. Okay, James was the first of the 12 to die the death of a martyr. He's cut down by a sword in front of a jeering crowd by Herod. The event is recorded in the book of Acts. John did live a long life, but he was exiled to the island of Patmos by the Roman government after he had already paid a full share of suffering as well. Okay, so they did get to drink from the same cup as Jesus. So be careful what you ask for. All right. But to sit at my right or left is not for me to grant. These places belong to those for whom they have been prepared by my Father. So this whole exchange is not really going to help them very much. All right. And then when the 10 heard about this, they were indignant with the two brothers. So they probably feel a little bit like these guys are trying to cut them out and put themselves ahead of the rest of the disciples. And so we already know that they used to sit around and argue about which one of them was the greatest. So it's not just James and John that are trying to get ahead in this little group. So Jesus called them together and said, "You know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them." And so the word Gentiles here is ethnos, it just means people. And so he's really just saying that all the people of the world are this way if they don't know God. They're just doing their own thing, and that means that when they are a ruler of some kind, they lord it over the other people. They exercise their authority. They want to be the boss. They want to be like admired and obeyed. They want to be on top of the heap with a bunch of people underneath them. And then Jesus says, "It shall not be so with you." And so we cannot be this way. All right, it must be different for us. And so this whole attitude of like wanting to be first and wanting to be on top is what we're going to call the spirit of the Gentiles here. And so this is how the Gentiles operate. But Jesus says that it's not going to be that way with his followers. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be your slave. Just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. So he's laying out this concept that if you want to be first, you have to be last. If you want to be first with Jesus, you have to become everyone around you's servant. So he's introducing a perspective that is radically different than the one that they have. He's talking about the way up being down for us. And so the Gentiles think that they will be happy when everyone admires them and they have power and everyone does what they say. And the more control over people's resources you have, the happier you will be. And the followers of Jesus should be trying to get under people. In the kingdom of God, it's about how many people you can get over you as you lift the people up around you. And so this is extremely counterintuitive from a human point of view. And this is a servitude. He even uses the word slave here. So being a slave of others is the way to get ahead in the kingdom of God. And he uses himself as the prime example of that. So he's not asking them to do anything that he's not doing himself. All right. 28 says, just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. So you know what a ransom is, right? So this term is used a couple of different ways in the ancient world. Sometimes nobles or kings would be like captured in battle and they would be sold back to the side that they were on. And so that's where we get the proverbial expression, a king's ransom. All right. So how much will you pay to get your king back? So we're Americans, so we wouldn't pay anything to get our king back. But other cultures might pay a lot. So we have records of governments paying hundreds of talents of gold to get their king back. And so another way that this term was used has to do with slaves. And so 25% of the people in the Roman Empire were slaves. They had no rights at all. But some slaves would like squirrel away money, or they would have a friend, or a benefactor who would put money away for them. And a slave could be ransomed, or they could ransom themselves, and then they would be freed men. And so this world that Jesus is talking to is very familiar with the idea of ransom. All right, prisoners and slaves were commonly ransomed in that day. And so the teaching here is that we are all kind of in prison with a death sentence because, like, the wages of sin is death. And this is exactly what Jesus is saying when he says that the Son of Man has come to give his life as a ransom for many. And so at the cross, Jesus is going to ransom us out of prison and out of our death sentence and give us freedom. And so really what we're looking at is a side-by-side comparison here of the heart of man and the heart of God. And the contrast is so great that you could hardly exaggerate the difference between what we're seeing in these like sons of Zebedee and in Jesus Christ. So let's look at this for a minute. And so if you think about us as humans, we don't really have that much in the way of real power. All right, Spurgeon once said that you could not even create a fly. That's true. Okay, I wouldn't even know where to begin if I was going to try and create a fly, let alone create the rest of all of this. Okay, so we are not so powerful as we like to think that we are. On the other hand, Jesus has infinite power. He dwells in unapproachable light with the Father himself. And we, with no power at all, really, are constantly seeking for more power. We wish we had power. We are, trying to get promoted into management or some executive position. That's the desirable place for us to be. And Jesus, who has infinite power, lays that power down. He voluntarily sets it aside and comes not to be served, but to serve. And he gives his life. So back when we studied the incarnation of Christ, we read this. So we're going to read it again. It's Philippians 2, starting in verse 3. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, but in humility consider others better than yourselves. Each of you should look not only to your own interest, but also to the interests of others. Your attitude should be the same as that of Christ Jesus, who being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but made himself nothing, taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness. And being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient to death, even death on a cross. The most disgraceful and most shameful of all deaths. All right, he's hung, spread eagle, buck naked, and slowly tortured to death. All right, this is the extreme that he went to. He went from dwelling in heaven with God and having all the prerogatives of God to allowing himself to be killed on a log dropped in a hole in the ground. All right, and that's our example. That's what this concept looks like. We need to stop promoting ourselves and stop trying to bring people's admiration onto ourselves. We need to lay that aside and serve. We need to get down on the ground like a slave. All right. Humans don't really have any right to demand anything at all. Whereas Jesus deserves to be recognized as the Son of God. He has the right to demand reverence and to compel obedience. And yet we, who have no right at all, do demand love and protection. We demand provisions and we demand security. We act like we're entitled to all this stuff. And if we feel them slipping away, we get all mad. Okay, we get angry with God for not delivering what we think we deserve. And we often get mad at other people for just the same thing. And even though Jesus deserves to be absolutely and without question followed, he decides to leave his creatures the freedom to follow or reject him, however they choose. It's a pretty massive difference there. Human beings are guilty of evil that does disqualify them. And really, we shouldn't be followed under any circumstances. Okay, we are self-serving, we are duplicitous, we are not really trustworthy, we take advantage. Okay, have you ever had a history book open? Okay, that's what humanity is. We are treacherous and we are violent. Nobody should be following us. But Jesus isn't guilty of anything. He's a morally perfect example. And he's already done the thing that he's calling on us to do. He laid his aspirations and his rights to leadership aside, and he's just asking us to do the same thing. Okay, humans don't have any idea what's really best. When people are following us, we are really just guessing at which way to go. But Jesus does know exactly what is best in every single situation. There's no guesswork at all for him. And so he should be followed wherever he goes. Humans are proud. Mostly we just want to be recognized for just how awesome we are. Okay? And even though we don't really have anything to be proud of, okay, we feel a lot of pride. We sure don't want anyone telling us what to do. We don't want our autonomy infringed on in any way. But what is it that we're so proud of when each and everything that we have was given to us? Our existence, our intellect, our gifts, our resources, our opportunities, our place in time was all given to us. Okay? But interestingly, Jesus is very humble, even though he deserves praise and glory. He's the one person with the right to be proud, and yet he isn't. He's God, and God should be recognized as supreme. But the Trinity possesses a very strange humility. All right, there's a Father who no man has seen or can see. Jesus kept saying that he did all things for the Father, never once glorified himself. He gave all the glory to the Father. And the Holy Spirit, takes of Jesus and gives to us. He also doesn't glorify himself at all. The Spirit glorifies Christ. Christ glorifies the Father. And the Father doesn't really make a show of himself. It's a little strange that we never really are shown any of this glory that's given. The Trinity is not terribly self-promoting. Okay? Humans are like self-serving, whereas Christ is quite obviously others-serving. And we're constantly obsessed with what we can get, but Jesus was intent on what he was able to give. And he had a plan with a cross in it to give everything. And so this is a fairly severe contrast that we're looking at. And it hits us with two key points that we need to take away from all of this. The first one is that we should be willing to follow Christ's leadership. All right, this guy is not self-serving. He's not self-glorifying. He's truly humble and truly giving. He paid the ultimate price in order to rescue us or to ransom us. And so he's kind of earned our trust. And that's a pretty big question if you're going to follow anyone. Can you trust them? Well, you can trust Jesus. And so from that standpoint, he deserves to be followed. And the second point here is that we should learn to imitate him in our own leadership roles. God does not call us to follow. He doesn't just call us to follow. We're supposed to learn how to lead in following. And so he's not talking about leading in the spirit of the Gentiles. He's talking about leading the way that he leads. And so servant leadership is where you get under other people and you serve them. That's what leadership is supposed to mean for us. And as Christians, we're all called to become that kind of leader. So maybe your leadership role is as small as just being like a positive influence on your friends instead of just going along with whatever they're doing. Maybe you cast an influence in a direction that lifts people up. So that would be steering people for God. If you have a family, then you are a leader. All right. If you are officially some sort of leader, like a teacher or a supervisor, then it's obvious that you're a leader and you should be trying to figure out how to do that in this godly way. And so any little group of people that you are in, you are called to lead in a direction towards God. And we particularly need to understand what we mean by leadership here. It means just what Jesus says it means. Okay, it means serving people. It means to become a slave to them. And so let's look at a few of these things just a little bit more in depth. So Christ's leadership, the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. So that's the verse that we just looked at. And there's that word ransom. So we already talked about this some. But when you're buying a prisoner, you're paying off their sentence. Okay? And this word would apply. And so if you were buying someone out of debtor's prison by paying off their debts, there would be this list that they had that was called a certificate of debt. And it had on it all of the debts that you owed. And the list was posted on your jail cell. All right. Each prisoner had a certificate of debt posted on their cell. If your crime was more serious and you're sentenced to like a galley to row a boat, like in the movie Ben-Hur, all right, then your certificate of debt was nailed to the edge of your bench where you sat in the row. And so each prisoner had a record of why this was their fate. And so if it was a capital crime, then it would be nailed to your cross so that everybody who walked by could see why this guy was being crucified. And so you'll recall that Jesus had a certificate nailed to his cross, but because of the conflict between the Jewish leadership and Pilate, who was not terribly fond of the Jews, Pilate didn't write a true crime on the certificate that was nailed to Jesus' cross. He wrote, Jesus Christ, the King of the Jews. That's what was nailed over Jesus' head. And Matthew says that the Jewish leadership tried to get him to change it. And Pilate says, yeah, what I've written, I've written. He liked it. Okay, he thought it was funny. And so it's ironic that Jesus had no crime except to be the King of the Jews. Colossians 2:14 has a little bit more to say about this. It says that every single one of us has a certificate of debt. And Jesus took every single one of them and nailed them to his own cross. And Jesus had no real crime on his own certificate of debt. So it was replaced with our certificate of debt, which did have real debt on it. And that's the crimes that he was killed for. And the last thing that Jesus says when he's on the cross is that he calls out with a loud voice, tetelestai. Okay, tetelestai is a Greek word. Our Bible generally translates it as "it is finished." But it's an interesting bit of historical trivia that word is the very word that they would write over a prisoner's certificate of debt when the debt of the sentence was finished. It's the equivalent of like a paid in full stamp. And so they would roll up the certificate of debt with tetelestai written on it and hand it to the prisoner so that he could keep it, so that he could avoid being prosecuted for the same thing again. And so that's the word that Jesus cries from the cross. And if you had a certificate of debt with tetelestai written across it, that's a pretty important document. All right, you don't want to lose that. You should probably keep it with you. Okay? And so we have that, and we have our certificate of debt with "it is finished" written across it in the red of Christ's blood. But we have to accept it. All right? Are we willing to have our certificate of debt nailed to his cross? There's a decision to be made there. Do you want to come before God with the claim that we deserve to be there because we think we're a pretty good person? Or do we want to come before God on the day of judgment and hand him that certificate that already says paid in full? And if we trust in Jesus, then that certificate's going to get us through. All right, then God is going to welcome us in. Anyway, let's think about becoming a servant leader a little bit too. And so it's not just that we follow the ultimate servant leader, it's also that he wants us to become really good servant leaders ourselves. So this is pretty important. God needs people that are willing to lead in this servant leadership kind of way. And so our culture today has been described as being postmodern. All right, it's a dumb way to describe a culture. Someday it'll have a different name, I'm sure. In it, in our culture, people hate the idea of authority and leadership. And so the popular notion is that nobody has any right to tell me what to do. And so we engage in almost any relationship or some kind of like workplace ethics. The key to all of those situations is like power relations. And so we make sure that we are empowered and that we're not marginalized by the powerful. And so the key for us in all relationships is to balance the power inside the relationship. And so if you're having some trouble with your spouse, there's probably some imbalance in the power relations. And if you can balance that out, then it'll, work itself out. But at the bottom of all of this kind of thinking is that it is not okay for you to have more power than me. And if we all have the same amount of power, then we're off on the right foot in our relationship. And so how are all the relationships in our culture doing that are based on that kind of thinking? More marriages end in divorce than are successful. And so, what are we really talking about here? My clicker didn't work. Come on, man. I know what I'm supposed to say, but you need to be able to see the slides. Let's try this. There's a button down here. There we go. So this push for equality for like every single marginalized group is defined in terms of power relations. And it's really just, the spirit of the Gentiles that we're talking about. It's the same thing that Jesus was talking about. In our modern version, it's like, okay, I'm not going to lord it over you, but you better not be lording it over me. All right, so we're in this standoff where it's not okay for anyone to get a leg up on anyone. All right, and this is a crappy basis for relating to people. Okay, Jesus said that it shall not be so among you. We're supposed to be breaking away from the world's point of view on this thing. And, we're supposed to be headed in a whole different direction. It's still not working. In that passage in Philippians, Paul said, do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. All right, and isn't ambition always selfish? Is there such a thing as ambition that's not selfish? In fact, there is. So there is a type of ambition that's not selfish. It's when your ambition is to use the gifts that you've been given for the good of other people. Okay, that is what you aspire to. And you have as your ambition to serve other people and to have God boost up the people around you through you. Okay, that is exactly what we are being called to here. In 1 Timothy 3, Paul says, here is a trustworthy saying. If anyone sets his heart on being an overseer, he desires a noble task. So he's talking about being a leader in the body of Christ, like an elder. And Paul says that if you are aspiring to that, that's like ambition, but that's like a good thing. Because if you properly understand the nature of leadership in the Christian context, then what you are aspiring to is to be the slave of all the people around you. All right? And there's nothing wrong with that. Okay. So there's an interesting book called Lead Like Jesus. They come up with some pretty good points on this thing, and we're going to go through a couple of them if the slides change. And so it says that most leadership books focus on the leader's behavior, and they try to improve leadership style and methods. Emphasis is on the hands of the leader. They attempt to change leadership from the outside. Yet in teaching people to lead like Jesus, we have found that effective leadership starts on the inside. It's a heart issue. The heart is more important than the hands. All right. We believe if we don't get the heart right, then we simply won't ever become servant leaders like Jesus. They say the most persistent barrier to leading like Jesus is a heart motivated by self-interest. I think that this probes a little bit deep. All right. And so the more honest you are with yourself, the more you will realize just how self-interested your motivations are. And they're saying that that is a barrier to me being a leader in the mold that Jesus has for me. My self-serving, my self-interest, right? Now, I might not come right out and say that, but, in my heart, that's there. And in all likelihood, it's in yours as well. They ask if you are a self-serving leader or a servant leader, and they give a few things to look at to help determine that here. One of them is how you handle feedback, particularly critical feedback is what they're talking about. And so when somebody doesn't like the way that you handle something or says that something you said wasn't that good, or maybe someone tells you that the way that you come off is causing problems in your relationships, right? So you know what it feels like to be criticized, and you know what the immediate reactions are. There's defensiveness. There's immediately the idea that the other person just doesn't really understand where you're coming from, or they're just stupid, all right? Maybe you tell yourself that they're resentful, jealous, whatever it is. You know, you're having all these thoughts to fortify and justify your position. We're generally not that happy to receive negative feedback. Okay, almost never do we immediately see the opportunity to clean up some weaknesses. Okay, it's just hard to feel that way sometimes. And so let's not lie to ourselves. All right, do you remember the last time you were criticized? It's hard. Okay, it's hard to act right. We bristle, we strike back, and even if it's just in our minds and in our hearts. Okay. Here's another interesting question. How well are you planning for your successor? And so if you're in some kind of leadership role, do you have a plan in place for someone else to take over? What's going to happen when your session of influence ends? And from day one, you should be looking for someone to raise up. You know, maybe a lot more than just one. Someone. And then we spend energy trying to boost these people up and get them ready, get them trained. And when they're ready, get out of the way so that they can lead. Okay, and then look for someone else to do the same thing. All right, the work doesn't end. We're constantly trying to replace ourselves. And that's not terribly easy for some of us to get our head around. Okay, we like having a following. We don't want to get replaced. You know, some of us can't wait to get replaced, but that's a different kind of problem. But we want to keep the good people with us instead of like sending them off to lead. All right, but every time you send someone off that's ready to lead, that's an act of sacrifice. Okay, you are sacrificing the time and the energy that have been poured into them and, you know, placing it in God's hands. It's an act of serving leadership. Okay, and around a servant leader, everyone around them seems to be being empowered, but not the leader themselves. All right. Are you trusting in something other than God? All right, this question will find you out. What we refer to as leadership could very well become manipulation. Okay, we kind of can go through a project of projection where we know that if we say this, then they will think that. And if I do this, then people will probably react this way. And so we're always trying to like weave a way through where people will do what I want them to do. Okay, and we're trusting in our methods and in our cunning and the tricks that have worked in the past, and we are not putting our trust in God. All right, and the proof of this is in our completely lame prayer life, which is supposed to be a warning. All right, but we have become masters of rationalizing it because we are way too busy to spend a bunch of time praying for people. All right, but the fact is that we are not trusting in God. We are making things happen in the flesh. All right, so another interesting question is, are you valuing opinions other than God's? The question of pleasing men. All right? Paul says that if he was going to please men, then he would not be serving Christ. Serving Christ is the antithesis of pleasing people. And so you could say that this is one of the big draws for me in serving Christ. All right, I'm no good at people pleasing. But if you're conceiving of servant leadership as a groveling and weak version of leadership where you're telling people what they want to hear and, kissing the butts all around you so that all are appeased and like flattering people so that they feel good about themselves, then you've got it all wrong. All right, that's not at all what servant leadership looks like. Often the most serving thing to do is to come down hard on people when they need it. All right, that really is serving. The flatterer and the butt kisser is serving self. Okay, pleasing men is not done for their sake. It is a manipulative tool to serve yourself. And is there pride in your heart? So I tried to avoid putting this one up on the slide, but the stuff in this book is pretty good at exposing this stuff. And so the person that never stops talking or is always talking about themselves, they're constantly telling stories where they are the central character and they seem pretty cool, right? So are you the hero of all of your stories? Right? That's pride. And we develop varying levels of sophistication in covering this up because, you don't really want to come right out and just say how awesome you are. But we're boasting in a slightly more subtle way. All right, and we also keep a couple of other stories that we use to cut down certain people. Okay, we sometimes need to make sure that nobody gets the idea that someone else has more value than we do. All right, that's pride. And when there's pride, then you have yourself a self-serving leader, not a servant leader. What about fear? I think this is an interesting thing to be on this list. But, these guys make a pretty good case that fear and anxiety are hallmarks of a self-serving leader. All right, a self-serving leader is trying to line everything up so that things go the way that they want them to go. And when you stop to think about it, all of the things that could go wrong, there's a lot of them. All right, and all of a sudden, there's just everything to worry about. And we're pretty insecure about the whole thing. And so this is obviously not an attitude that is trusting in God. Trusting in God is when it's like, if God wants me to be in a leadership position, then I'll be in one. If God doesn't, then I don't care. I'll get out of the way. And so the attitude of someone that is truly depending on God wouldn't have this fear associated with it. But, when we're trying to get all the dominoes to line up so that they all glorify me, then there's plenty to worry about. And the thing that we're really worrying about is that people might start to guess the truth. All right? They might see you for who you really are. And that's terrifying for some of us. How about comparison? It would also be a sign of a self-serving leader. Right? You're always looking around at the performance of the people in similar positions. There's this competitive attitude where we're constantly comparing how we are doing compared to others. We're threatened by anyone else's success. When someone says something that's cool or insightful, we wish we had said it. All right? Why would we be concerned with all these comparisons? It's because we need to satisfy ourselves that, we're out in front of the other people. It's pretty obviously self-interested, and it's a pretty definitive sign. Okay, we got to be honest with ourselves. And so one comment that's made in this book is that one moment of honesty is better than years of self-deception. All right, it's a pretty good place to start if you might have problems in this kind of area. And so, not sure it would be a terribly wise thing to claim that you have no problems in this area. So if you are even partially human, then you've got problems in the area of being self-serving. And if you don't believe that, then you're twice deceived and extremely dark in your understanding of yourself. All right. I hope that God will open your eyes to see. All right. But he's going to have to do that with all of us. And it happens in successive ways. You know, we can see some of it, and then we see it again a little bit deeper, and then we see it really deep to the point that it gets a little bit gross. We don't want to talk about it anymore. All right. And this is where it ties in with the wrap that we did last week on grace. And so you better get both hands on the wheel when it comes to grace so that you can handle seeing all of the nasty stuff about yourself. Okay. It's going to hurt as God opens your eyes to your own egotism. Okay. Trust me. All right. So it is possible to have an ambition that's not a selfish ambition. It's an ambition that benefits others and it moves others ahead. It's an ambition that uses me to make others better. All right, that's a good ambition, Paul says. All right, so what do we think about people that are afraid to take on Christian leadership? Because, like, if you let yourself be put in that position and it flops, then, you know, that's going to be some tremendous blow to the ego. All right, I've heard lots of people say things that really amount to this. All right, it's about not wanting to look like a failure or look silly. It's really just the spirit of the Gentiles. All right, this is about me preserving my ego. And there are a few different types of temperament that guard their ego this way. But the fact is that, like, servant leadership is always a blow to the ego. So if you step forward into servant leadership, you are basically offering to have your ego chopped up. Okay, we need to get outside of the ego and get into being a servant. In the Gentile boss style leadership and authority, everyone wants to get into that kind of leadership. All right, the guy sweeping the floor at night sits down at the CEO's desk and dreams of being there. All right. In fact, he really believes that someday he will have a chair just like that. And he believes that if the world was a just place, he would already have that chair. All right. Everyone thinks that they should be the boss and that the boss has got it made. Okay. It's not working. There we go. All right. So in servant style leadership, people tend to sort of shy away from that. They see the cost of it and they really don't want any part of it. It does have a cost. It costs everything. If you try to pay just part of the price and hold back a little bit something for yourself, it doesn't really work out. All right, and what we have to do is just be completely fearless. It's a fearlessness that comes from real faith, not just the faith to believe that we can be forgiven. All right, this is a more advanced type of faith. And so it's not just that I can be forgiven, it's also that I'm going to trust God with my life and with the well-being of my ego and with my personal happiness and with my reputation, with everything. All right, I'm going to put it all in God's hands, and I'm going to trust him with all of that. It's denying yourself for the sake of the one who denied himself for you. All right, there are some great promises that Jesus made about this. He did say that if we lose our lives for his sake, we'll find it. But if you're trying to hang on to your life, you'll lose it. It's pretty counterintuitive stuff. The way up is down. We really need to think that, I don't know. I just think that we need to hang on to the things that we can. And Jesus is saying that we need to let it all go. We need to lose our lives for his sake so that we can find it. It's a pretty deep thing to spend some time considering. And I really believe that we should all do that. We should spend some time thinking about this kind of thing. All right, so we're going to draw the line there on this thing this morning. Next week, Jesus is going to begin the final week of his life. And it starts getting kind of crazy, and then it just gets crazier. So he walks into Jerusalem, and everything kind of comes to a head all at once. But for this morning, that's all I have.